Welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I am very excited today to bring two old friends on the show to get into a subject that is not unfamiliar to people, but that I don't think has been given the proper treatment, especially by the mainstream media. The normie commentariat likes to talk about the schism in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement over foreign policy. It is always framed as the split between establishment hawks and neo-isolationists, and more so establishment versus MAGA. My guess no better. This is a rich debate, one that has been going on the right for over a century, much less over the last news cycle. And I'm happy we are here to talk to that. And of course, the impact on foreign policy on the upcoming elections. So first, I have my friend and former boss, Jim Antle, who was the editor of the American Conservative and now executive editor of the Washington Examiner magazine. He was also back in the day the managing editor of the Daily Caller and also edited and wrote for the American Spectator. Curt Mills is the current executive director of the American Conservative and has written extensively for that magazine and others. He has served as Washington bureau chief of Spectator World and reporter for the National Interest. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
So, Jim, let's start off with you. The mainstream loves to frame this issue of foreign policy division on the right as just another MAGA data point. Right. As an insider, can you explain what it's really about?
Well, obviously, there's a little bit of truth to the fact that one of the reasons why the schism has sort of reemerged is obviously this has been a long-term division among conservatives and Republicans, but the reason it has become salient again is in part because you have Donald Trump, and in part because you have this ascendant populist wing of the party that is more skeptical of intervention overseas, particularly in the Middle East, but also more broadly elsewhere. But we also have the one area in which the Republican Party is actually growing is with working class voters, and these working class voters are very war weary after 20 years of basically more or less unending wars, particularly in the Middle East, but also smaller interventions elsewhere. They're at least somewhat socially conservative, a little harder to pin down economically. And these are the new voters who are turning toward the Republican Party. And so these voters are not interested in a lot of war. They would like to see the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. be more inward looking in terms of priorities more generally. And so that's really a big part of this. And I think keeping the focus on MAGA is at least in part a way to try to marginalize and discredit this. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of people inside the Republican Party who are doing a good job of marginalizing themselves, but it is certainly the case that there are still important voices in Washington, D.C. who would like to, have anything that deviates from the consensus of the last 20 years be part of this MAGA crazy town, put on your horns and storm the Capitol, and, not a real discussion of what our foreign policy priorities should be.
Is that working, Curt?
The audio or the dynamic in the Republican Party?
Well, the attempt to marginalize those restrainer-leaning Republicans and conservatives as, MAGA waving freak flag, horn-wearing types in Washington.
I mean, I think it depends on what valence. I mean, I think it's a done deal in presidential politics. I mean, it's hard to see how the establishment has all that much representation with Trump. They're going to try. I mean, if Trump won, I think we already have the president of the first term in which he did appoint or tried to work with a number of establishment type figures, and that dynamic may yet readily replicate itself in some form. But this message has now won convincingly 3 straight Republican primaries, and it really has been. It's not like Mitt Romney ran as like this open, super. I mean, I think his team was relatively neoconservative, but that was not the leading edge of his pitch in 2012. In fact, I mean, he didn't have George W. Bush at his own convention.
Right.
So it has been close to 2 decades now where this has not been the leading edge. I think the last time that it was in presidential politics was McCain, who is the worst loser in the modern era, or at least my adult life. I think where it's interesting is the relative lack of representation and skill at the lower levels. So I think you saw some of this going on this past weekend with the Ukraine vote. What MAGA, for lack of a better term, does not have is chairmen of House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Yeah.
Does not have chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or ranking member. The institutional DC at the Republican level still remains not this sort of like middling, Machiavellian sort of middle ground like that a lot of Republicans occupy now, but like overtly what could be called the security state Republicans, people like Michael McCaul, et cetera. And so it's a real tension, and it matters for like getting legislation out of the House, as we saw the Speaker cave essentially to one faction this past weekend, a faction that was not in the majority, I should note, of his own conference.
When you see the mainstream media, even Republicans themselves, dismissing restraint-oriented conservatives as neo-isolationists, I have heard this term more in the last 2.5 months than I've heard in the last 3 years. It's almost as though it is a talking point that's come down from War Party headquarters, that isolationists are on the march, and anybody who's questioning Ukraine aid, if they're questioning even, Biden's policy on Taiwan or grand strategy writ large, like questioning NATO and whether or not that mission should be sustained, they are neo-isolationists. Do you think that indicates that there is a little fear going on the other side about the energy in the conservative base right now regarding foreign policy, that there's a there that they have to be a little nervous about?
Well, I think the fact that it's not limited to specific personalities anymore, even though I think they would like to reduce it to, Marjorie Taylor Greene or, whomever is the most offensive personality that they can find. It's not just Pat Buchanan, it's not just Ron Paul, it's not just Rand Paul. It's really at this point not even just Donald Trump. So it is a real wing of the party that members of the congressional leadership are going to have to deal with. Mitch McConnell quite obviously decided he didn't want to have to deal with it anymore. It was a factor in why he decided to step down from leadership. So there's certainly that element. There's also just the fact that a lot of the people who write about these things and cover these things, grew up learning that the big debates were between the isolationists and the people who wanted to stop all of the various forces of evil in the world. So even though that viewpoint started to become criticized and even caricatured at the nadir of the Iraq War and the late second term of George W. Bush, it's really still a mindset that's remained prevalent. And I think by tying it to MAGA is a way to kind of, realism and restraint were sort of sophisticated and urbane things during Barack Obama's presidency. That doesn't mean I think that he was a very good representative of those views, but at least during that time period, that was sort of the image of retrenchment and priorities in foreign policy and things like that. Those were things that smart people believed in, sophisticated people, many Democrats. Now this is something that is isolated, no pun intended, with the rubes, with the yahoos, with the extreme right, which I don't think is an accurate portrayal, but it is potentially, at least in the medium term, a somewhat politically effective one. It does definitely seem to have given the neocons, and people would object to being called, many people would object to being called neocons, but would say that, somebody who wants 4 wars instead of 6 is an isolationist. But, it has given the interventionist side a little bit of pep in their step, even if in many ways the momentum is shifting away from them.
What about you, Curt, as an editor of a magazine that I'm sure has been called isolationist from the very beginning? Have you seen an uptick in those attacks? And how do you respond to them, whether within conservative circles or just writ large?
I'd actually, not to jinx it, I'd actually just have to say it's objectively down. I mean, compared to where this perspective was in the Obama administration, and even if you had to criticize Trump from the restraint right in the 2010s. I think there's like a clear audience for this in the party. In fact, in the open spaces, I mean, take something like Twitter or X, right? I really don't see. Perhaps it's just my algorithm or whatever, but it seems like if you're just looking at that, like the debate was lost. Like people did not think the Ukraine aid was a good idea. That was the vibe that I got from X. I mean, it's an interesting channel. Then if you go on a lot of the different right wing websites, that's the vibe. Even Fox News, I would say, is a mixed bag. I mean, they'll just oscillate openly between uber hawk anchors. Like the Wall Street Journal editorial board report thing on Saturday will be uber hawkish, and then like they'll follow it up with another guy who says the direct opposite thing, who's contradicted by Mark Levin overtly. So, I mean, there's a lot of Fox News politics we can talk about. That's not what it's about. And then in terms of our own receptiveness in this town, I mean, I think we're working at it. We're doing a good job, but I also think to a certain extent we're pushing up against more of an open door than we dealt with as a staff 5 years ago. That being said, I would just echo what I said in my first cut, which is that's because the power is not actually the war power, perhaps you would use, is not actually arguing their case in the open field. And if they are, it's at a very elite level, right? It's not at the political magazine level. It's not at the street level, because they have no appeal. I think if they could get a massive pro-Ukraine military funding, kill Putin rally in the streets, they would do it. It's just not on the cards.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I worry, and I guess this is just political reality, that a lot that you're seeing on Fox News, for example, is anti-Biden sentiment. I'm not so sure a lot of those voices would still be against Ukraine aid or fighting that proxy war at all if a Republican was in the White House. But within that orbit, I know we have people like JD Vance, like Matt Gaetz, Tom Massey, Rand Paul, Warren Davidson down the line who are principally against the aid, particularly in its unconditional fashion, that it's not tied to any strategy to get out of the war, to win the war. And so I do think that there's a divide, but that's politics. You're going to see
Well, I
that
totally agree with you. The
at
only
any
thing I would
time.
just quickly respond to is that I do think the nature of this fight, though, would be different under a conservative administration or under just straight up a Trump administration, because the dynamic here is the subtext is almost text. Like Trump is a lawless autocrat who needs to be excluded from politics, and he's in a alliance with a league of autocracy, globally. And so it is both the Democrats and the establishment wing of the Republican Party that are levying this argument. If Trump were the president and and I don't think it's a fait accompli by any chance that we're going to pull out if he's the president. Who knows what he'll do? He did escalate from where Obama was with the javelin expenditure. But like it would be much more narrow. Like, are we defending Trump's specific policy on Ukraine? And I think you'd see new battle lines. But I don't think this exact fight would be replicated at all if Trump was the president. So that's all.
Jim, does it make it difficult that we really don't have a detailed policy prescription from the Trump campaign as to how they would handle this war once back in office? So it kind of leaves it open to interpretation how Trump would pursue the Ukraine war and how he's positioned for against aid, for against prolonging the war. He says he's going to end it in 24 hours, but he doesn't really give any detail. So it's almost as like it's a Rorschach test where people could just say, sort of interpret it the way they want.
Sure. Well, I think for good and for ill, Trump fancies himself a deal maker. And so what he would like to do and how he would like to go down in history is as a guy who solved these conflicts. And I think he particularly believes he might be able to solve the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I think having those impulses, are largely to the good and largely to the benefit, I think, of our perspective on these matters. But it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get those kinds of outcomes, because it does make it much more contingent on what kind of deals can Trump get, who does Trump appoint to negotiate on his behalf. Obviously, Trump is very responsive to how the leaders involved treat him and speak of him. And I think both Putin and Zelensky have been very wise to, try to curry some degree of favor with Trump, and they will both up the ante on that should he return to the White House. So, I don't think there's a guarantee of a good outcome, but I do think Trump isn't going into this with, say, the white hat versus black hat, and the diplomacy is bad, and that sort of viewpoint on it. The risk with Trump, in addition to the fact that he can always be influenced by relatively petty things, is that there are some things where you just can't get a deal that pleases everybody. I mean, you can get a deal that people might be able to live with, and that might conclude the war. But because Trump is so pragmatic, I think in domestic politics, you see this with how he talks about abortion. Well, if somebody could have come up with a way to resolve the abortion issue in a way that pleased all sides, that probably would have happened 50 years ago. There are some matters that are of principle and, don't lend themselves well to negotiated settlement. But I think Trump is right that in a lot of cases, especially when you're dealing with rough characters overseas, that sometimes moral suasion isn't the way to go in terms of resolving some of these things. Sometimes it does take leverage and just sort of hard-nosed negotiating.
Yeah, I'd like to shift a little bit to other voices in this world beyond Trump. Curt, you just wrote I believe it's the cover story for the latest American Conservative. No politician, you'd say, J.D. Vance, in this cover story, which is entitled, How Ohio Became the Center of the Republican World, you say no politician in America is as staked out as clearly on the stalwart issues of foreign policy realism, trade realism, and immigration restriction. No one. Can you talk a little bit about his role in this orbit, and maybe a little bit about how he's become sort of a figure of curiosity by the mainstream, who seem to so dearly want to peg him as a MAGA crazy, but acknowledge that there's just more to him than that, and that he's having some real life appeal, both to his constituents in Ohio, but also with the conservative base, who are really reaching to have more leadership, particularly on the foreign policy issue.
Sure. I think there's a lot going on with Vance. What I would say is, first, just rewinding the tape, he was a never Trumper in 2016 on basically pretty Baroque lines, lines that are almost only reflected in like the pages of our magazine. He was a never Trumper, not for neoconservative reasons, but effectively for paleoconservative reasons, for lack of a better term. He agreed with Trump's agenda that was written in the pages of various op-ed boards. He praised Trump after he sort of flayed Jeb Bush at the South Carolina debate. But he said he didn't think Trump had the character or the competence to get it done. Trump, of course, won. Vance has changed his view of Trump the man and also the accomplishments in his appraisal of the first administration. And that will become a subject of great speculation if he's, again, running this year as potentially vice president with Trump, as is widely reported to be plausible. I think additionally, he is, he's probably the national politician that I can think of with a most explicit appeal towards his biography since Obama, right? So I think they're very different, but
both of whom became famous for writing books about themselves before they achieved political success.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. So I think you would have seen him be a top shelf politician if he had won a major race as he did, almost regardless of his views. But the fact that he has thrown in so clearly now with a certain tendency is very important. And then additionally, I think he has, sort of edged himself out at the current moment from both other senators who potentially could fill this slot, both for reasons of ideology and personality. I do think he very much likes being in the mix. He's a natural politician. He's kind of a glad hander. He has a lot of relationships throughout DC. I think other potential successors are colder and don't have as wide of a network or aren't as ideologically aligned with this. And then additionally, he has the constant platform of the Senate where like other big names in Trump conservatism, i.e. Carlson, someone like that, do not. So there are advantages and disadvantages. And then I think additionally, what's important about him is that he does seem to have an authentic relationship with the Trumps and particularly the son, Don Jr. And that's its own element given Trump's known anxieties about not wanting to appoint a successor or having someone upstage him. Like if his appeal was he's just Barack Obama, like that would probably be bad for him, just to say of the politics, but like also as persona, his persona is quite different. So, Vance, quickly, I mean, it's just forgotten. He's only been in the Senate for 16 months. And he is, I think, one of the most important people in the world now. And it is a testament to the absolute scarcity of representation of this tendency, beyond Trump. And he has definitely stepped up. I think also very importantly, he served in the military, which I think is also crucial to the biography linking it. And he's Midwest finally, which is obviously the linchpin of what Trumpism is, right? I mean, like if another Republican could figure out a way to win in Virginia, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, recreate the kind of Bush Sun Belt coalition, then I think you see a different Republican Party, the party that talks about trade protection and foreign policy restraint and wins in Midwest. Much different flavor.
Jim, I know you've been around for a while, and in the conservative world, usually you have to work your way up through the movement. A lot of these guys and gals starting like in college with the college Republicans and all sorts of the, ISI and other groups. I mean, you just don't pop in as quickly as JD has, establishing these networks like Curt mentioned in Washington, establishing bona fides in their state, establishing bona fides with a conservative world that, I'm sorry, it could be a little bit insular on the politics side. I mean, Curt mentioned a lot of data points about, his biography, his state, his smarts, his military background. But what is it about JD Vance that has allowed him or has catapulted him to this position that Curt has said the most important politician in the world right now?
Well, I think one is that I think it helped that he initially wasn't identified with Trump. He was there. There was a time period where the outside world was just dumbfounded by Trump's political success. So they were interested in people who maybe were not, devoted to Trump, but were willing to explain some of the political conditions that led to his success. So if you could speak eloquently about what was going on in the Rust Belt, if you could speak eloquently about what was going on in the Midwest, if you could talk intelligently about the consequences of maybe the decline in American manufacturing in some of these key states. If you could talk about what was happening with fentanyl, if you could talk about what's happening in some of these communities, that was a really sought after commodity for about the 30 seconds or so that people were shocked enough that they wanted to understand the Trump phenomenon
Right.
rather than attribute it to Russia or extremism or bury it in some form or fashion. So Vance was very well known and read in circles that were not particularly Trump friendly, even on the right early on. And then he gradually came around to the viewpoint that whatever he might think of Trump's flaws, that Trump was in fact the leader of the political movement that wanted to move things in the direction that he wanted to go. And therefore, you either sort of get on board with that or you don't. And so he did. I think the things that are the dilemma I think that they're going to have in the next few months is the fact that I don't think that the numbers of representation are quite so bad as much as I think the quality of representation of these viewpoints are bad. And so Vance is probably the highest quality populist right lawmaker
Yeah.
in Congress. And is it better to have a person like that in the Senate where one, you have an ally, if Trump gets elected, you have an ally on Capitol Hill, with things very much in a state of flux among Senate Republicans? Or is it better to have, a populist Dick Cheney, a vice president who maybe is a little more attuned to some of the policy details than even Trump himself, might be very helpful in the staffing of the administration, which was a huge problem in the first term. And then maybe be able to put things in a better position for there to be a successor who'd be aligned. But that's a tough question, I think, to answer.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about national security because if let's just assume that Trump does win, there does seem to be some serious tension going on over what kind of national security staff, foreign policy direction that the Trump administration would take, because there are people on both sides of that ledger who are vying for influence right now. I think there was an article, and I'm sorry I don't have it up right now, that pinpointed Rick Grinnell as a possible national security, I don't know if it was advisor to a new Trump administration. He is not altogether friendly to the restraint position, not as friendly as, say, a J.D. Vance would be. Are you concerned that do we have enough people on the inside or potentially on the inside that would prevent some of the scary position picks that Trump had in the first administration? I'm thinking John Bolton off the top of my head. Have we improved things, or have conservatives improved things enough to ensure that there'll be people on the inside with a more restrained point of view?
I think it'll be better. So I'm comfortable forecasting that if should he win. I think there were changes that were going on in 2020 that would have made his second term better than the first, at least on the foreign policy side of things. And to be clear, I think the first term was way better than Bush 43 or even Obama. So, but I know the article you're referring to is, I believe, it's the Alex Word piece that said that Bill Hagerty, Rick Grinnell, Robert C. O'Brien, and Bridge Colby were in the mix for either NSA or Secretary of State. think that all tracks. Think that's probably accurate, but like it's a Trump runners and writers article in April.
Yeah.
I think you will see a mad scrum if he wins, and I do think certain things have changed. I do think the overt neoconservatives either won't work with him or he has fired a lot of them for these prestige jobs. I think you're not going to see that kind of thing considered. And someone like a Bolton has so clearly broke ranks with them. I do think, though, that there is this large gray area of people that could be called clearly hawks or have a hawkish pedigree who could be in the mix, like Grinnell, and someone like Tom Cotton, for instance, as well. I also do think that the chief matters. Actually, I think the chief's going to matter a lot. It seems like there's going to be a chief of staff this time. I know there were a bunch, but by the end of it, it was Mick Mulvaney was like interim. They never gave him the job. It's sort of ridiculous. But like I do think there's gonna be like an attempt to have a real chief, and if that chief is Kushner, for instance, as has been talking about, like that's obviously pretty clearly valence on the Middle East. If the chief is someone like Stephen Miller, I think that's pretty different. Like I think it all depends, and if the chief is a tactician like Susie Wiles or something like that, then I think that doesn't really solve the conundrum. It just throws it up in the air.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a gray area of people who can't be called neocons or wouldn't want to be called neocons, and we don't get the neocon debate. And I think Jim, avoided it for the right reasons. But I think that contingent exists, and if you are a purist, it's a reason not to vote for him. But I certainly think the aperture for a change foreign policy is just so much wider with the Trump second term than a Biden second term.
I mean, the way around it for a lot of the more hawkish voices who could potentially play in a Trump administration is that they disavow the idealism of neoconservatism. They don't believe the United States has the capacity to change foreign countries in the way that a lot of neoconservatives of the Bush era did. They don't believe in democracy promotion. And in some cases, they may be a little bit more selective about where they would project force. I do think they have a lower threshold, though, for the use of military force. And I'm not just talking about, Robert Taft or Ron Paul. I'm saying that what would have prevailed in the Reagan or Bush 41 administrations, which were not, non-interventionist administrations or even wholly realist-dominated administrations, but they were, their threshold for when you would use military force would be higher than what some people vying to influence Republican foreign policy would be today.
Yeah, my basic heuristic is always that I think at this point, the greatest existential risk of a Democratic administration is a war with Russia, and the greatest existential risk of a Republican administration is a war with Iran. And so, I think the Russia war situation goes way down with Trump elected, and I think the Iran war situation goes up. Even though I don't think Trump believes in the Iran hawk crusade really at all.
Well, let me ask you about that, because and I know we're running out of time, but Tucker Carlson was such an influence over Trump's foreign policy during that administration. He had his perch at Fox News. He had cautioned against escalating war with Iran. And, to my mind, Tucker has gotten even better on foreign policy over the last 4 years. I love to hear him talk about it. He's very principled. He's not an a la carte, non-interventionist or a restrainer, or whatever you want to call it. He's got, fundamental point of view about U.S. role in the world and the use of its military. I still think he would caution against escalating with Iran, and he's gone farther than a lot of folks on the right on even Israel-Gaza. But does he have the same amount of influence without his perch at Fox News? And what kind of role do you think he'll play in the general election and in the run up to that war, in terms of kind of whipping the base into shape, and on point on foreign policy issues.
For me or Jim?
Either of you want to jump in?
And I think he's still a very important voice. Obviously, not having the Fox show alters the type of audience he's reaching a bit. So, there are still people, even though the numbers aren't huge, they're still important numbers that would watch a cable news show but wouldn't watch something on X or Twitter or whatever it's called this week. And so there are people who really liked Tucker, who were otherwise fairly conventional Republicans, who are not going to hear that perspective in quite the same way. I mean, I think Laura Ingram's views are actually somewhat Tucker adjacent. I think other younger Fox hosts have sort of tried to imitate Tucker, but you have Mark Levin still has his show where he has it. Not having Tucker does in that Fox slot does have some kind of impact. Although I do think he does still have Trump's ear, which obviously if he's president matters a lot.
Yeah, I think he's a major celebrity, and I think he'll be big. I think it'll be different than it was without the show. I tend to fade the idea that it's this catastrophe. Also, I think very importantly, I'm not sure he's thinking about it. I mean, I think he's just like doing his thing, and we'll see what happens, and would not short his influence at all.
Yeah, and I think that there are other voices out there that carry the message in their own way. Like Tucker, I say, non-interventionist, realist. I think that he's an America First conservative who looks at foreign policy through the lens of an America First. Yeah. And I think that there are a lot of conservatives that resonates with when you frame the issue around that. But then there are other folks like David Sachs, same. But then Joe Rogan, I'm thinking Dave Smith on the libertarian end, a lot of folks at the breaking points. I feel like we all share much of the same point of view on I would say foreign policy in general and the critique of U.S. foreign policy over the last 20 years and what needs to happen. And we just talk about it in different ways. And I think Tucker has done wonders for providing a message and messaging for conservatives who don't want endless wars anymore. And up until now, and thanks to Trump too, didn't really know how to vocalize it. And so I want to ask one more question and I'll let you go. How much will foreign policy play into the upcoming general election? I know when it comes down to it, people vote with their pocketbooks and how they feel about the economy. Will their feelings about Ukraine or Israel feed into how and if they vote in November?
Well, one depends on how bad things get in either of those theaters, right? So, it could become a higher priority if things continue to deteriorate on both fronts. Also, it could contribute to a basic impression that the world is just out of control, which tends to work against the incumbent president. Joe Biden would be to some degree blamed for that if there's just this sense that everything is out of control and in flux. But there's also, even if foreign policy is not the primary issue, there is just the fact that the election's likely to be decided by tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states. And if Michigan is one of them, that alone could mean that foreign policy has played a pretty big role in the election.
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty big. I don't generally agree with the consensus that it doesn't matter in electoral politics. I will say I agree with Jim. I think the generalized impression that things are going poorly, we're out of control on the world stage, is a big problem. I think people actually forget about the Trump election, that ISIS was going on like it was. And you could say, like, well, it's not really coherent to say, like, should vote for. I just think it hurt the Obama sense of his handling it, or at least the Democrats handling of it, especially because Hillary's negatives are a lot higher than Obama's. Like, well, why give it to like the same crew, but someone we don't like as much? This, sort of vibe. And then the second thing I would say is I just think clearly Israel is just a toxic asset for Biden's political portfolio. Like I just fail to see how he wins. Like if that's all we're talking about, if this is in October and there's campus protests as they come back, I think they'll probably die down for the summer, but if they come back, new semesters, it's still going on. I think that's really bad. And I think it's actually quite similar to abortion for the Republicans. If all we're talking about is abortion, that's going to damage Republicans. If all we talk about is Israel, the Democrats are in trouble.
Yeah. Well, I hope you guys will come back on the show and talk more as the election campaigning unfolds. And thank you for joining me on my show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Kelly.